The warning lights inside the merchant ship, Silent Aurora, flashed red as Hannah gripped the control panel with trembling hands. The solar flares had hit without warning, frying every navigation system on her small trading vessel. Now she was falling toward the blue and white planet below, completely helpless to stop it. Hannah was only 23 years old, barely considered an adult by her people's standards. This was supposed to be her first solo trading mission to prove herself worthy of joining the Villani Merchant Guild. Instead, she was about to crash on an alien world that her people whispered about in fear. Earth, the planet of the violent humans. Her opalescent skin shifted from its normal pale gold to a worried silver as the ship shook violently. Long silver. Hair whipped around her face as she tried every emergency procedure she had been taught. Nothing worked. The main engines were dead. Life support was failing. Even the emergency beacon was crackling with static. Through the cracked viewing port, she could see snow-covered mountains rushing up to meet her. Mountains that looked impossibly cold and hostile. Her people, the Villani, had evolved on Thermos Prime, a desert world orbited by 3 suns. Their bodies were designed for constant warmth. Even a cool breeze could make them sick. The freezing temperatures of this northern region would kill her in minutes. The ship hit the mountainside with a grinding crash that threw Hannah across the small bridge. Metal screamed against rock as the Silent Aurora carved a deep furrow through the snow, before finally coming to rest in a grove of tall pine trees. Steam rose from the heated hull as snow began to pile up against the damaged vessel. Hannah pulled herself up from the floor, feeling pain shoot through her left arm. The viewing port was completely shattered now, and icy air was already pouring into the cabin. Her breath came out in visible puffs as the temperature dropped rapidly. She had never experienced anything this cold in her entire life. Moving as quickly as her injured arm would allow, she stumbled toward the cargo bay where the emergency supplies were stored. Each step felt harder than the last as the cold began to affect her alien metabolism. Her people's bodies simply weren't designed for this. Where humans might feel uncomfortable, she was already approaching the danger zone. The cargo bay was slightly warmer, insulated by containers of trade goods she had hoped to exchange with Earth's merchants. Rare crystals from her homeworld, healing, herbs that grew only in desert heat, and beautiful fabrics woven from silk produced by creatures that lived in scorching caves, all worthless now if she couldn't survive to trade them. She found the emergency kit and pulled out a thin thermal blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. But it was designed for mild temperature drops during space travel, not the brutal cold of an Earth winter. Already she could feel her body beginning to shut down its non-essential functions to preserve core heat. Her fingers moved slowly as she tried to activate the emergency beacon. The device sparked and died. The backup beacon did the same. Everything. Electronic was failing as moisture from the melting snow seeped into the damaged systems. Outside, she could hear the wind howling through the trees. Snow was falling heavily, already beginning to cover the crash site. Soon her ship would be completely buried, invisible to any potential rescuers. Not that she expected any help from the humans. Everything her people had heard about Earth's inhabitants suggested they were territorial and aggressive toward outsiders. Hannah pulled cargo containers together to create a small shelter in the corner of the bay, then crawled inside with her inadequate blanket. Her skin was shifting from silver to a pale blue now, a dangerous sign among her people. Her breathing was becoming shallow, and her thoughts were growing fuzzy. She thought about her family back on Thermos Prime. Her parents would be expecting her return in 3 months with stories of successful trades and new contacts. Instead, she was going to die alone on a frozen world, millions of miles from anyone who cared about her. The cold was getting worse. Her body was betraying her, designed for warmth and completely helpless against this alien environment. She tried to stay awake, knowing that sleep in these conditions might be permanent, but her eyelids felt so heavy, and the numbing cold was almost like a blanket itself now. As consciousness began to slip away, Hannah managed one final attempt at the emergency beacon. A weak signal pulsed out into the stormy night, barely strong enough to reach beyond the trees. Then darkness claimed her, and the young alien trader lay still in the wreckage of her dreams, her body slowly freezing in the merciless Earth winter. The storm raged on, burying her ship deeper with each passing hour. The blizzard hit like a wall of ice and fury, turning the already dangerous situation into a nightmare. Wind speeds reached over 60 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. The temperature plummeted to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprepared human in hours. For Hannah, it was a death sentence measured in minutes. Inside the cargo bay of the silent Aurora, her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her skin had shifted from its worried silver to a frightening blue-white color that would have terrified any Villani. Medic. This was the final stage before her body's complete shutdown. Her breathing had become so shallow that her chest barely moved, and her heartbeat had slowed to a dangerous crawl. The storm wasn't just affecting the crash site. 30 miles away in the nearest town, power lines snapped under the weight of ice and the force of hurricane-strength winds. Transformers exploded in showers of sparks, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Cell towers toppled like giant metal trees, cutting all communication with the outside world. At the regional rescue center, frustrated coordinators watched their equipment fail one by one. Search and rescue helicopters sat grounded in their hangars, unable to fly in conditions that would be suicide for any pilot. Ground teams couldn't even leave their base, as the roads had become impassable rivers of snow and ice. "We've never seen a storm this bad," muttered the rescue chief, staring at weather reports that showed the blizzard strengthening rather than weakening. Even if we had a location, we couldn't reach it. But they didn't have a location. Hannah's initial distress signal had been too weak and too brief to get a proper fix. All they knew was that something had crashed somewhere in a 100-square-mile area of wilderness. Finding it would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, assuming they could even get out there to search. Back at the crash site, Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness. In her brief moments of awareness, she could hear the storm trying to tear her ship apart. Snow was piling up against the hull, and she could feel the temperature dropping even further as her ship's remaining heat leaked away into the frozen ground. Her people had stories about cold like this. Ancient legends from before their civilization, when their ancestors had lived in the deep caves beneath Thermos Prime's surface. The old tales spoke of the white death that came when the suns were blocked, a cold so fierce it could freeze the very breath in your lungs. She had always thought they were just stories meant to frighten children. Now she knew they were real. With enormous effort, she forced her stiff fingers to move across the control panel one more time. Most of the systems were dead, but buried deep in the ship's core was one final option: the emergency life pod protocol. It wasn't designed for her current situation, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The system was meant to eject a small survival pod in case of catastrophic hull breach in space. But the mechanism also included a powerful heat signature beacon designed to help rescue ships locate survivors floating in the void between stars. If she could activate it without actually ejecting the pod, it might create a heat pulse strong enough to be detected by thermal sensors. The problem was that using it would drain every remaining bit of power from her ship's core. Her life support would die completely, and any chance of staying warm would vanish. But at this point, staying warm wasn't really an option anyway. She was already dying. This was her only chance to at least signal for help, even if she wouldn't live to see it arrive. Her vision was blurring as she initiated the sequence. Warning lights flashed weakly as the ship's computer protested the command. Emergency protocols demanded confirmation for such a drastic action. With her last bit of strength, Hannah pressed her palm against the bioscanner and whispered the authorization code in her native language. Deep in the ship's core, systems that had been shut down for hours suddenly roared back to life. The emergency beacon charged up, drawing power from every available source. Then, like a dying star's final flare, it pulsed outward in a burst of heat and electromagnetic energy that lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of warmth and light. In the middle of the worst blizzard the region had seen in 50 years, then everything went dark. The ship's core died with a mechanical sigh, and the last traces of heat began to fade from the metal hull. Hannah collapsed unconsciously beside the control panel, her body finally giving up its fight against the impossible cold. But somewhere out in the storm, her message in a bottle had been cast into the wind. June had been tracking a pack of wolves for 3 days when the storm hit. As a wildlife photographer, he was used to harsh conditions, but this blizzard was unlike anything he had experienced in his 15 years of wilderness work. He had taken shelter in a small cave system he knew, while waiting for the worst of it to pass. His thermal imaging scope was one of his most valuable pieces of equipment. It helped him spot animals in conditions where regular cameras were useless. He was using it to check on the wolves' den across the valley when something strange caught his attention. A brief flash of heat, much warmer than any animal signature, had appeared for just a few seconds about 2 miles north. At first, he thought it might be another photographer's camp, or maybe a lost hiker with a flare gun. But the signature was too intense and too brief. It looked more like some kind of electronic device overheating and burning out. In weather like this, that could mean someone was in serious trouble. June checked his gear. He had cold weather clothing, rated for -40 degrees, snowshoes, emergency medical supplies, and enough food for several days. More importantly, he had spent 5 years as a volunteer with the local mountain rescue team before focusing full-time on photography. He knew how to find people in conditions like this, and he knew how to keep them alive. The journey through. The storm was brutal. Even with his experience and proper equipment, he had to stop every few hundred yards to check his compass and GPS. The wind was so strong it kept knocking him off balance, and the snow was so thick he couldn't see his own feet. Several times he had to dig himself out of drifts that came up to his chest, but he kept going. Something about that heat signature bothered him. It had appeared suddenly and died just as quickly, like a final distress call from failing equipment. If someone was out there, they were probably running out of time fast. After nearly 2 hours of fighting through the blizzard, he spotted something that definitely didn't belong in the wilderness. Dark metal was visible through the snow, too smooth and angular to be natural rock. As he got closer, he realized he was looking at some kind of aircraft, though unlike any design he had ever seen. The craft was about the size of a small private jet, but the hull was made of a strange metallic material that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Strange symbols were carved along the sides, definitely not from any human language he recognized. One end of the vessel was buried deep in the snow, while the other end had torn through several large pine trees. June called out, but his voice was swallowed by the howling wind. He circled the wreckage, looking for an entry point. Most of the craft was sealed tight, but he found a section where the hull had been torn open during the crash. Warm air was still trickling out, which meant there might be life support systems still functioning inside. He squeezed through the opening and found himself in what looked like a cargo area. Containers were scattered everywhere, some split open to reveal contents that definitely weren't from Earth. Crystalline structures that glowed faintly, fabric that felt impossibly soft, and other items he couldn't even begin to identify. That's when he saw her. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, curled up behind some overturned containers. At first glance, she looked almost human, but her skin had an opalescent quality that shifted colors in the light. Her hair was pure silver, and her features were more delicate than any human he had ever seen. She was clearly not from Earth. More importantly, she was dying. Her skin had turned a frightening blue-white color, and frost was actually forming on her exposed arms and face. Her breathing was so shallow, he had to put his ear close to her mouth to make sure she was still alive. Her pulse was weak and slow, classic signs of severe hypothermia. June didn't hesitate. He had seen hypothermia victims before, and he knew that every second counted. Species didn't matter right now. This was a living being who needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. He immediately began stripping off his thermal layers. His heavy parka, insulated pants, thermal underwear, even his wool socks. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he ignored it as he carefully wrapped the alien girl in his warm clothing. She was so small that his jacket practically swallowed her entire body. Next, he activated the chemical heat packs from his emergency kit, placing them against her core body areas. He had learned in rescue training that gradual rewarming was crucial. Too much heat too fast could actually kill a hypothermia victim by shocking their system. He found a space blanket in his pack and wrapped both of them together, using his own body heat to help warm her. The metal blanket would reflect their combined heat back at them, creating a small pocket of warmth in the freezing cargo bay. As he held the unconscious alien girl, monitoring her breathing and pulse, June realized his life had just taken a turn he never could have imagined. Moving Hana from the crashed ship to his shelter was one of the most difficult things June had ever done. She weighed almost nothing compared to a human, but the storm was so fierce that every step was a battle. He wrapped her completely in his thermal gear and space blanket, then carried her against his chest to share what little body heat he had left. The wind tried to knock them both down repeatedly. Snow stung his exposed face like tiny needles, and his hands were going numb despite his gloves. But he kept putting one foot in front of the other, following the GPS coordinates to his emergency shelter. He had discovered this cave system 2 years ago and spent months turning it into a proper survival base. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of icicles, carved into the rock face about 8 feet above the ground. June had built a rough ladder from fallen branches, which was now buried under 3 feet of snow. He had to dig it out with his bare hands before he could climb up, all while keeping Hana secure in his arms. Inside, the cave was a different world. The temperature was still below freezing, but it felt tropical compared to the blizzard outside. More importantly, it was completely windproof. June had spent weeks waterproofing the interior and setting up a proper survival station. He had camping equipment rated for extreme conditions, a small propane heater, emergency food supplies, a first aid kit, and even a portable solar panel system with battery backup. The cave had 2 chambers connected by a narrow passage, giving him plenty of space to work. June quickly laid Hana on his sleeping bag and began setting up the heater. The small blue flame provided immediate warmth, but he knew he had to be careful. Warming someone with severe hypothermia too quickly could cause their blood vessels to dilate suddenly, leading to dangerous drops in blood pressure or even cardiac arrest. He arranged his heat reflectors around the sleeping area, creating a warm pocket of air that would gradually raise the temperature. Then he activated several chemical heat pads, placing them carefully against Hana's core areas, but not directly on her skin. The heat needed to penetrate slowly and evenly. Her condition was still critical. Her skin remained that frightening blue-white color, and her breathing was barely perceptible. But as the minutes passed, he began to notice small changes. Her lips, which had been nearly colorless, started to show the faintest hint of a natural pale pink. Her breathing became slightly deeper. June had treated hypothermia victims before, but never anyone whose normal physiology was so different from human. He wasn't sure if standard human treatment would work on her alien biology. He could only do his best and hope that the basic principles of warming and stabilization would apply to any living creature. After about an hour, something remarkable happened. Her skin began to shift colors, moving away from the dangerous blue-white toward a pale silver. It was like watching a slow-motion sunrise, the color change spreading gradually from her core outward to her extremities. Then her eyes opened. They were unlike anything June had ever seen. Large and luminous, they seemed to glow with their own internal light. The irises were a pale gold color that shifted and swirled like liquid metal. For a moment, they stared at each other in complete silence. Then terror filled those beautiful alien eyes. She tried to sit up and scramble away from him, but her body was still too weak from the hypothermia. A sound came from her throat that might have been words in her own language, but to June it sounded like musical notes filled with fear. Hey, it's okay," June said softly in Korean, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. He kept his voice low and gentle, the same tone he used when approaching frightened wild animals. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone seemed to penetrate her panic. Her breathing slowed slightly, though she still watched him with obvious terror. "I found you in your ship," June continued, switching to English in case she might understand that better. "How you were freezing. I brought you here to get warm." He gestured slowly around the cave, then pointed at the heater. "Warm. Safe." Her eyes followed his movements, and he could see intelligence there along with the fear. She was trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out if he was a threat. June reached slowly for his water bottle, moving deliberately so she could see exactly what he was doing. He took a small sip, then offered it to her. "Water," he said simply. She stared at the bottle for a long moment, then at his face. Something seemed to click in her mind. This human had saved her life. He had given her his own warm clothing and brought her to safety. Now he was offering her water. Very slowly she reached out and took the bottle. Her hands were shaking partly from the cold and partly from fear, but she managed to take a small sip. The water seemed to help clear her head a bit. "June," he said, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. She hesitated for a long moment, studying his face. Then, in a voice like wind chimes, she whispered, "Hannah." The first full day was the hardest. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to recover from the severe hypothermia. Every few hours, June would check her pulse and breathing, adjusting the heat sources around her as needed. He barely slept, worried that her alien physiology might react differently to warming than a human would. During her waking moments, she watched him with those luminous golden eyes, still wary, but no longer terrified. He moved slowly and deliberately around the cave, making sure she could see everything he was doing. When he prepared food, he would show her the packets and ingredients first. When he added fuel to the heater, he would point to it and say warm in both Korean and English. By the second morning, her skin had shifted from the dangerous blue-white to a healthier pale silver. She was able to sit up on her own and take small sips of warm broth that June prepared from his emergency rations. He had learned that sudden movements made her tense up, so he began moving even more carefully around her, treating her like he would a wounded animal that was slowly learning to trust. Communication was their biggest challenge. Hannah clearly had her own language, musical and flowing, like nothing June had ever heard. Sometimes she would try to say something important, speaking rapidly in those bell-like tones, then grow frustrated when he couldn't understand. But gradually they began to develop their own system. June started by drawing simple pictures in the dirt floor of the cave, a stick figure of himself pointing to his chest and saying June, then a smaller figure with long hair pointing to her and saying Hannah. She caught on quickly, nodding and repeating the names in her own musical accent. He drew the sun and said warm, then rubbed his arms and smiled. She understood immediately, pointing to the heater and attempting the word herself. Warm, she said, though it came out sounding like a gentle song. Food was easier to explain. He would hold up items and name them. Water, bread, soup. Hannah was an eager student, repeating each word, and then offering what sounded like the equivalent in her own language. Soon they had a basic vocabulary of survival terms. By the third day, Hannah's recovery was remarkable. Her skin had returned to its natural pale gold color, shifting occasionally to silver when she was concentrating or curious about something. She was strong enough to move around the cave, examining June's equipment with obvious intelligence. She seemed fascinated by his camera gear. When he showed her pictures of the wildlife he had been photographing, her eyes lit up with wonder. She pointed to a photo of the wolf pack and made a sound that was clearly a question. June nodded and made a rough howling sound, which made her laugh. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. What impressed him most was how quickly she adapted to their situation. She began helping with small tasks around the cave, organizing supplies and keeping the fire going. When she saw him preparing their daily ration of food, she would point to herself and then to him, asking with gestures if she could help. Her help was more valuable than he had expected. Her alien physiology seemed to give her advantages in some areas. Her eyesight was much better than his in low light, and she could hear sounds that were beyond his range. Several times she alerted him to changes in the storm outside before he could detect them himself, but it was the small moments that really showed him who she was as a person. When he accidentally cut his hand on a sharp edge of equipment, she immediately rushed to help, making distressed sounds and pointing to his first aid kit. When he sneezed from the dust in the cave, she brought him water without being asked. Her actions showed genuine concern for his well-being. On the third evening, as they sat by the small heater, sharing a meal of heated rations, Hana did something that surprised him. She reached into what remained of her torn clothing and pulled out a small crystalline object that glowed with soft blue light. It was beautiful, about the size of a marble, and it cast gentle patterns on the cave walls. She held it out to him, speaking in her musical language with obvious sincerity. Even though he couldn't understand her words, the gesture was clear. This was a gift, something precious from her world that she wanted him to have. June was deeply moved. He understood that this small alien girl, stranded millions of miles from home, was offering him one of her few remaining possessions as a way of saying thank you. He accepted the crystal carefully, then reached into his own pack and pulled out one of his favorite photographs, a stunning sunset over the mountains. Near his home, he offered it to her, saying simply, "Thank you, Hana, from my world to yours." She took the photograph with obvious reverence, studying the colors and composition with the eye of someone who appreciated beauty. Then she looked up at him and smiled, and in that moment, all barriers between human and alien seemed to disappear. They were just two beings, taking care of each other in the wilderness. By the fourth day, Hana had learned enough English words to attempt more complex communication. She would combine her broken English with elaborate drawings scratched into the cave's sandy floor, creating a strange but effective language that only she and June understood. It started when she drew what looked like stars scattered across a large circle. She pointed upward through the cave entrance and said, "Home, far, far." Then she drew a smaller circle next to the first one and pointed downward. "Earth, here." June realized she was trying to explain where she came from. He nodded encouragingly and pointed to her drawing. "Your planet? Your home world?" "Yes, yes," she said excitedly, her skin shifting to a bright silver that he had learned meant she was pleased or excited. She drew more circles, showing him that there were many worlds, many planets with people like her. Then her expression grew more serious. She drew stick figures around her home world, lots of them, and pointed to herself. "My people, Velani." The word came out like a musical note, beautiful and flowing. Next, she drew stick figures around the Earth circle, but these were different. She made them larger, more angular, and when she pointed to them, her skin shifted to a worried grey color. She pointed to June, then to the Earth figures, clearly asking if he was one of them. "Human," June said, pointing to himself. "I am human. You are Velani." Hana nodded, but she still looked troubled. She began drawing what looked like ships flying between the worlds. Then she drew the Earth figures holding what were clearly meant to be weapons, making aggressive gestures toward the ships. "Bad," she said, one of the first English words she had learned. Humans, bad. Fight, hurt. June felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. She was telling him that her people thought humans were violent and dangerous, that they had been watching Earth from a distance, but were too afraid to make contact because of humanity's reputation. He thought about human history and realized her people weren't entirely wrong. Humans did have a tendency toward violence, especially when encountering something they didn't understand. First contact with an alien species would probably terrify most people, but that wasn't the whole story of humanity. June reached for his camera bag and pulled out his laptop. The battery was running low, but he had enough power to show her some photos. He scrolled through his collection until he found what he was looking for. The first photo showed him with his mountain rescue team. 5 men and women in bright orange jackets smiling at the camera with rescue equipment spread out around them. He pointed to himself in the picture, then to the others. "My team," he said slowly. "We help people, save people." He showed her more photos from his rescue work. People being carried down from mountains on stretchers, hikers being pulled from avalanches, search teams working through the night to find lost climbers. In every picture, humans were helping other humans, often risking their own lives to save strangers. Hana studied the photos carefully, her skin shifting through different shades as she processed what she was seeing. These weren't the violent, aggressive humans her people had warned her about. Next, he showed her pictures of his family, his parents, both retired teachers who had spent their lives educating children. His sister, who worked as a nurse in a hospital for poor families. His nephew and niece laughing and playing in their backyard. Family, he said, pointing to each person and explaining their relationship to him. Mother, father, sister. They are good people, kind people. He could see her worldview beginning to shift. She pointed to his sister and said, "Help people like you." "Yes, like me. Many humans help people. We are not all bad." Hannah was quiet for a long time, staring at the photos. Then she began drawing again, this time with more careful detail. She drew herself standing between two groups of figures. On one side were the Villani, huddled together in fear. On the other side were humans, but instead of holding weapons, she drew them with their hands extended in greeting. "Me," she said, pointing to the figure in the middle. "I come to learn, to see if humans, good or bad." Now June understood. She hadn't just crashed on Earth by accident. She was part of some kind of scouting mission, sent to evaluate whether humanity was ready for contact with her people. "What were you supposed to learn?" he asked. She struggled with the English, switching between words and drawings. From what? He could understand. She was supposed to observe human behavior from a distance, then return to her people with a report. The Villani Council would decide whether to attempt formal contact based on what she discovered. But now, everything had changed. Instead of observing humans from afar, she had been saved by one. Instead of seeing humanity's worst traits, she had experienced their best. "Before," she said, her skin shifting to a sad blue color, "I think humans dangerous. Bad. Hurt. Villani." She pointed to June, then to herself, then made a gesture that encompassed everything around them. The warm cave, the food he had shared, the care he had given her. "Now," she continued, her skin brightening to gold, "I see different. You save. Me, you kind, you—" She struggled for the word, then simply pointed to her heart. June understood. She was saying that he had changed her mind about humanity. That his simple act of compassion had shown her that humans weren't the monsters her people believed them to be. But he also realized the enormous responsibility this placed on both of them. Her report would determine whether two species made contact or remained forever separated by fear and misunderstanding. The future of human-alien relations might depend on what happened in this small cave during a winter storm. On the fifth morning, June woke to something he hadn't heard in days. Silence. The howling wind that had been their constant companion had finally stopped. He stepped carefully to the cave entrance and pushed aside the ice curtain that had formed there. Sunlight, actual sunlight, was breaking through the clouds for the first time since the storm began. The world outside looked like a different planet. Snow had piled up in drifts that reached nearly to the cave entrance, 8 feet above the ground. Trees were bent under the weight of ice, and everything sparkled like diamonds in the morning light. It was beautiful, but June knew it would take days for rescue teams to reach this area, even with the storm over. Hannah appeared beside him, moving quietly on her bare feet. She had gotten much better at walking on the rough cave floor, though she still shivered whenever she got too close to the entrance. She looked out at the winter landscape with wonder, having never seen snow before her crash. "Pretty," she said, one of her newer English words. But then she pointed upward beyond the clouds, and her expression grew wistful. "Home?" June was about to answer when they both heard it, a sound unlike anything in Earth's skies. It was a deep humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the world's largest tuning fork. The sound grew louder, and then they saw it. The ship that descended through the clouds was nothing like human aircraft. It moved with impossible smoothness, defying gravity as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The hull was the same shimmering material as Hannah's crashed vessel, but this ship was much larger, about the size of a commercial airliner. Hannah's skin immediately shifted to brilliant gold, and she began making excited sounds in her musical language. She grabbed June's arm, her small hand surprisingly strong. "My people," she said in English, then continued in Villani, speaking so rapidly that her words blended into a continuous melody. The rescue ship landed in the clearing near Hannah's crashed vessel with no sound at all. A section of the hull simply melted away, forming an opening, and 3 figures emerged. They looked similar to Hana, but taller and more formal in their bearing. They wore clothing that seemed to be made of the same shimmering material as their ship, and their movements had a graceful quality that made them seem to float across the snow. The leader was a woman who appeared to be middle-aged by human standards, though June had no idea how Vellani aging worked. Her skin was a deeper gold than Hana's, and her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate style that defied gravity. When she spotted Hana at the cave entrance, her skin flashed through several colors rapidly. Surprise, relief, and something that might have been anger. But when she saw June standing beside Hana, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her skin shifted to a dark red color that June instinctively recognized as alarm or danger. The other 2 Vellani immediately moved to flank their leader, and though they carried no visible weapons, their posture was clearly defensive. They had found their missing scout, but she was in the company of one of the supposedly dangerous humans. Hana quickly moved in front of June, speaking rapidly in her musical language. Even without understanding the words, June could hear the urgency in her voice. She was explaining what had happened, trying to make them understand that he wasn't a threat. The leader, who Hana had addressed as Mira, listened carefully while never taking her eyes off June. Her skin color shifted through several shades as Hana spoke, and June wished he could understand their conversation. Finally, Mira held up her hand for silence. She studied June for a long moment, taking in his appearance, his relaxed posture, the way Hana stood protectively in front of him. Then she spoke, and to June's surprise, her words were in heavily accented English. "You are the human who found our scout?" June nodded. "Her name is Hana. I found her ship crashed in the storm. She was dying from the cold." "And you helped her?" It wasn't a question, but there was obvious curiosity in Mira's voice. "Of course I helped her. She needed help." Mira's skin shifted to a pale blue. Confusion, June had learned. "You did not know what she was. You did not know if she was dangerous." "It didn't matter what she was," June replied simply. "She was hurt and cold. Anyone would have helped." That statement caused all 3 Vellani to exchange rapid musical phrases. From their body language, June gathered that they didn't believe anyone would have helped. This was clearly not what they expected from humans. Hana stepped forward and began speaking again, this time slower and more deliberately. She gestured toward the cave, toward June, toward the supplies he had shared with her. She showed them the photograph he had given her and the small crystal she had given him in return. As she spoke, Mira's expression gradually changed. The defensive tension left her posture, and her skin color shifted from alarm red to a more neutral silver. She asked Hana several questions, and from Hana's animated responses, June could tell she was describing their time together in detail. Finally, Mira approached June directly. She was tall for a Vellani, nearly his own height, and her presence was commanding. But when she spoke, her voice was respectful. "Hana tells me you saved her life, that you gave her your own warmth when she was freezing, that you shared your food and water, asking nothing in return." "That's what people do," June said. "We help each other." "Not all people," Mira replied quietly. "We have observed your species for many cycles. We have seen much violence, much hatred between your own kind." "Yes, that exists too," June admitted, "but it's not all we are." Mira studied him with those luminous golden eyes, and June had the feeling he was being evaluated in ways he couldn't understand. Finally, she made a decision that would change everything. "I would like to learn more about humans like you," she said. The conversation that followed was unlike anything June had ever witnessed. Inside the Vellani rescue ship, which was even more impressive on the interior than the outside, Hana stood before what appeared to be a council session conducted over some kind of holographic communication system. The ship's main chamber was filled with floating displays showing dozens of Vellani faces, all listening intently as Hana gave her report. June sat quietly in the corner, unable to understand the musical language, but fascinated by the technology and the obvious importance of what was happening. Mira had explained that Hana's mission had been crucial to her people's future. The Vellani High Council had been debating for years whether to make contact with Earth or to avoid the planet entirely. They had sent 3 scouts to different regions of Earth to observe human behavior and report back. Hana's report from this remote wilderness area was the final piece they needed to make their decision. As Hana spoke, June could see the reactions of the council members in the holographic displays. Some looked surprised, others skeptical, and a few seemed almost angry. Their skin colors shifted constantly, creating a light show of emotions that June had learned to recognize during his time with Hana. At one point, an elderly Villani with deep bronze skin interrupted Hana with what sounded like a sharp question. Hana's response was passionate, her skin flashing bright gold as she gestured toward June. She pulled out the photograph he had given her and held it up to the display. Speaking rapidly about something, Mira leaned over to translate for June. Council member Keon is questioning whether your kindness was genuine or if you had ulterior motives. He suggests you might have helped Hana, hoping to gain something from her advanced technology. June felt a flash of irritation at the suggestion, but he understood the suspicion. If the roles were reversed, if a human rescue team found one of their people with an alien, there would probably be similar questions. Hana's response to the accusation was immediate and fierce. She spoke for several minutes, her voice rising with emotion, her skin cycling through colors June had never seen before. When she finished, several council members were nodding thoughtfully. She is telling them that you had no idea who she was or where she came from when you saved her, Mira translated. She says you risked your own life in the storm to bring her to safety, and that you gave her your only warm clothes, even though it meant you could freeze yourself. Another council member, this one younger with pale silver skin, asked what sounded like a question. Hana's answer was shorter but no less passionate. He asks if you expected payment or reward, Mira continued. Hana says you asked for nothing except to make sure she was safe and warm. The debate continued for nearly an hour. June watched, fascinated, as what appeared to be the future of human-alien relations was decided in a language he couldn't understand. Finally, the elderly bronze-skinned council member who had been most skeptical asked a direct question that seemed to silence the entire assembly. Hana's response was the longest yet. She spoke with quiet intensity, occasionally pointing to June, sometimes touching her heart, sometimes gesturing to encompass everything around them. When she finished, the council chamber was completely silent. "What did she say?" June asked. Quietly, Mira's skin had shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. Council member Keon asked her what she recommends the High Council should do about Earth and humanity. Her answer was unexpected. What did she recommend? Instead of answering immediately, Mira turned to address the holographic assembly. She spoke briefly, and several council members responded with what sounded like surprise or approval. Then Hana turned to June and spoke in English, her voice filled with nervous excitement. "June, I tell them truth. I tell them you good human. You show me humans not all bad like we think." She took a deep breath, her skin shifting to a hopeful gold color. "I ask them something. Big something." "What did you ask them?" "I ask, you come with me to Villani worlds. Be first human ambassador. Show my people that humans can be friends, not enemies." June felt his world tilt. "You want me to leave Earth, to go to your planet?" "Not forever," Hana said quickly, "but for time. To meet High Council, to show them human kindness is real, to help both our peoples become friends." The implications were staggering. He would be the first human to leave Earth, to travel to alien worlds, to represent his entire species in negotiations with an advanced civilization. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but also an enormous responsibility. "What about my life here, my family, my work?" Mira spoke up. "The journey would take approximately 6 of your months. We would ensure your safe return, and your world would benefit greatly from the knowledge exchange." One of the younger council members said something that made Hana's skin flash bright silver with excitement. Council member Yuki says if you agree, and if meetings go well, we start trade between our worlds, share technology, art, knowledge, help both peoples grow. June looked around the ship's chamber at the incredible technology surrounding him, then at Hana's hopeful face, then at the council members waiting for his answer. He thought about his quiet life as a photographer and how it had led him to this moment that could change the course of human history. The choice was his, and he realized it was the most important decision anyone had ever been asked to make. 6 months after leaving Earth, June stood on a balcony overlooking the capital, city of Thermos Prime, still amazed by the sight that greeted him every morning. The Villani had built their cities from living crystal that grew like trees, reaching toward their 3 suns in spiraling towers that seemed to sing in the wind. The buildings glowed with soft inner light, shifting colors throughout the day in harmony with the sun's movements. It had been an incredible journey to get here. The voyage through space had taken 3 months aboard a Villani transport ship, and June had spent every day learning their language, customs, and technology. The Villani had been patient teachers, amazed by his quick adaptation and genuine curiosity about their culture. The hardest part had been saying goodbye to his family on Earth. His parents had been worried but proud, understanding that their son was part of something historic. His sister had cried, making him promise to come back with stories and pictures of everything he saw. The mountain rescue team had given him a small Earth flag to plant on the alien world, joking that he was their first astronaut. Now, as Earth's official ambassador, his days were filled with meetings, cultural exchanges, and the delicate work of building trust between 2 very different civilizations. The Villani High Council had initially been skeptical of him, testing his motives and sincerity in ways both subtle and direct. But Hana had been there every step of the way, serving as his cultural guide and translator. She had grown more confident during their time together, no longer the frightened crash survivor he had found in the snow. Her role as cultural liaison had given her new purpose, and she threw herself into the work of building bridges between their peoples. Their relationship had evolved during the long journey to Thermos Prime. What had started as a rescue situation had grown into genuine friendship, then something deeper. They spent hours together each day, sharing stories of their worlds, learning each other's languages, discovering the similarities that existed beneath their obvious differences. The breakthrough with the High Council had come during June's 3rd month on Thermos Prime. A group of Villani children had been injured in an accident at one of the Crystal Gardens, and they needed immediate medical attention. Without thinking, June had rushed to help, using his wilderness first aid training to stabilize the children until Villani medics could arrive. Council member Keon, who had been most suspicious of human motives, had witnessed the entire incident. Watching June risk his own safety to help alien children he had never met before, the elderly Villani finally understood what Hana had been trying to tell them. Humans were capable of genuine compassion, even for those completely different from themselves. After that, the formal negotiations had progressed rapidly. Trade agreements were signed that would benefit both worlds enormously. Earth would receive access to Villani energy technology and medical advances, while the Villani gained Earth's diverse art, music, and literature. Cultural exchange programs were established, and plans were made for the first Villani diplomatic mission to Earth. But perhaps the most important achievement was the friendship treaty signed between the 2 worlds. It established protocols for peaceful contact, mutual aid in emergencies, and shared exploration of other worlds. What had started with one human's simple act of kindness had grown into an alliance that would shape the future of both civilizations. June's daily routine on Thermos Prime had become surprisingly normal, despite the extraordinary circumstances. He woke each morning in his quarters in the diplomatic complex, a beautiful crystalline structure that had been grown specifically for the human embassy. After breakfast with the other human staff who had joined him from Earth, he would walk to the council chambers for his morning meetings. Hana usually met him at the transport station, and they would ride together through the city's tube system, discussing the day's agenda and sharing observations about their respective cultures. Her presence had made the adjustment much easier, and he had come to rely on her insights and friendship more than he had expected. Their evening walks through the Crystal Gardens had become his favorite part of each day. As the 3 suns set, the crystals would glow more brightly, creating a light show that was different every night. They would talk about their progress, their hopes for the future, and increasingly their personal feelings for each other. The romance had developed slowly, naturally, built on shared experiences and genuine affection. Despite their different species, they had discovered that emotions like love, loyalty, and hope were universal languages that needed no translation. News of their relationship had spread to both worlds, becoming a symbol of the new alliance. On Earth, they were celebrated. There's proof that humans could find common ground with anyone. On Thermos Prime, they represented the possibility of understanding between different peoples. As John prepared for his eventual return to Earth, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. He was no longer just a wildlife photographer from Canada. He was a bridge between worlds, carrying the hopes and dreams of two civilizations. The story that had begun with a simple act of kindness in a winter storm had become legend on both worlds. Children learned about the human who saved the Volani scout and the friendship that changed everything. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could have the greatest consequences. Standing on his balcony, watching the crystal city come alive with morning light, Jun smiled as he saw Hana approaching the embassy building. Soon they would return to Earth together, beginning the next chapter of their remarkable story.